at Oxfam in South Africa. I'd like to thank everybody for all your efforts in joining this meeting.
As Marianne said, Oxfam worries about inequality from the point of view of rights and social justice, so that's also sort of becoming increasingly prominent. I think another issue that's pushing inequality up the agenda is the increasing awareness of planetary boundaries, of constraints, environmental constraints on human activity. When you realize that the cake is finite, how that cake is divided up becomes much more important. So I think there's a kind of ecological, environmental aspect, most obviously in climate change. We can't have the entire planet producing 18 tons of carbon dioxide a year like the Australians do and avoid going the way of the dinosaurs. So clearly there's something about redistribution, there's something about the size and division of the cake which is coming up in lots of different fora. So inequality is going up in most of the BRICS, but you get outside the BRICS to the LICs, the low-income countries, and in most low-income countries inequality is falling. So there's some reason, and I'd love to hear people's thinking about why that is, that there's a divergence between the most powerful countries and the others, and that the others are actually doing rather better on inequality. There's nothing worse than a moderator becoming an extra panelist, so I'm going to shut up now and introduce the actual panelists. The first speaker is Dr. Adriana Erthal Abdenur from Brazil. She's General Coordinator of the BRICS Policy Center in Rio de Janeiro and a professor at the International Relations Institute at the Catholic University there. Second up will be Simon Ticehurst, who's currently Country Director of Oxfam in Brazil. He is our Latin America guru, really. He's had a lot of time in Mexico, in Central America. He's recently came from 5 years in Bolivia, so looking at another very interesting political experiment under Evo Morales there. And he's now the Brazil Country Director. He's going to be looking specifically at whether the Brazilian miracle is in fact a miracle, what's been achieved, what can be transferred, what can be learned. And then third is Isobel Frye, who's Director of SPI, the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, a very well-known think tank. She works with NEDLAC, the National Economic Development and Labour Council. She's overseen SPI since its infancy, so she's a SPI mistress, I guess. That's probably an old joke, I imagine. Yeah, sorry. And her own research areas are in poverty, socioeconomic rights and social protection. And she previously worked as a senior researcher in poverty eradication and social economic rights at COSATU.
Because frequently the BRICS are looked upon as examples of problems of inequality. We certainly have them. We share some of them are specific to our context. But it's also really important for us to look at the role of public policy, the role of state and non-state actors in tackling these challenges. And here we see that there have been some positive results from which some lessons can be learned. And this was the spirit behind the creation of this document, the BRICS Inequality Fact Sheet. Simon might say a little bit more about it, but I think of this as really as an exploratory product rather than a set of conclusion. And it's a point of departure for us, all of us stakeholders, to take the study of inequality and comparative inequality further and also start thinking about, well, what to do once we have these beautiful charts and graphs. Even though GDP growth in Brazil slowed down quite significantly for 2012, some of the main indicators regarding poverty and inequality continued to show improvement. Okay? So this sets a tone for a lot of the debates that are happening in Brazil. To what extent is Brazil's capacity to tackle inequality a product of underlying structural changes that date back even further? Or is this evidence of a decoupling to some extent of economic growth and the ability to tackle inequality? Because if it is, that's a really important finding, right? That we can navigate the oscillations of economic growth, defined as GDP, and yet still maintain to tackle some of the inequality challenges. The inequality fact sheet that we've begun working on with Oxfam through this exploratory document will serve as a basis for a much expanded and much refined discussion, so that instead of being obsessed with GDP, gross domestic product, will be obsessed with GDP, greatest development policies. Thank you.
So Brazil is still unacceptably unequal, and that's important to say. Its inequality is still above twice the OECD average. Okay, so a lot needs to be done still. But having said that, I think something significant and historic has happened in the past decade, and I don't believe in miracles. And I'm not going to portray what's happened in Brazil as a miracle. I don't believe it's a miracle. I believe it. There are some significant set of policies that have been introduced that we can learn from. But let's just quickly look at what has happened in Brazil. The Gini index has dropped by almost a percentage point in the last 10 years, which is kind of significant. And as you can see from this graph, it's the only country, Brazil is the only BRICS country that has made any kind of dent in inequality in the past 20 years, but in fact this has happened much more in the past 10 years. And as Duncan mentioned, amongst the G20 countries, it's by far the best performer in terms of addressing inequality. But there are only 4 countries in the G20 that are actually making any kind of inroads in terms of inequality. The income amongst the poor has grown at 550% more than the income of the rich in Brazil. Now this is only happening in the BRICS countries, it's only happening in Brazil. There's been a rapid reduction in extreme poverty, and just 2 weeks ago I was at an event, President Dilma Rousseff announced that the end to the officially registered extreme poverty in Brazil, the fact that 22 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty over the past 2 years. Also relevant, I think, for countries that are struggling with food security issues is that Brazil has largely dealt with the problem of hunger and food and nutritional security. This has all happened in a context of financial economic crisis, modest growth. First of all, I think it's important to recognize the whole process, the historical political process in Brazil that came out of a struggle against a military dictatorship for a return to democracy, which ended up in constitutional reform and a constitution which has it's basically a rights-based constitution. It establishes rights as the basis for constitutional rights, which is then followed up by a legal framework which takes that forward, and then subsequently by governments that actually take this a social agenda on board. We talk about these iconic cases of zero hunger in Brazil, and we talk about Bolsa Família, which is this conditional targeted cash transfer program, which have been very successful. But we often forget that this has happened side by side with other structural improvements, particularly in any significant increase in the minimum wage, increase in formal employment, increase in access to pension, and a universal pension, and also to credit. And these have been cited as key structural factors that have also contributed to addressing inequality. The other factor, I think, is that in 2003, when Lula came to power, the impression that, at least the explanation and the impression of the Workers' Party government at the time was that public policies and social policies were just completely dispersed and chaotic and done in a very sort of sectoral way. And what has happened is that public administrations tried to become much more integrated and coordinated across sectors and at different levels of government. One of the most important reasons for these programs, in fact, and particularly in the case of Zero Hunger, was the social participation aspect of these public policies. 75% of its councils, civil society, social movements, NGOs participate. And this is, not only does this make for more effective implementation of public policy, but it also means for more transparent monitoring. Okay? What are lessons we can learn? I think we need a health warning on the applicability and the transference of these experiences automatically to different countries, different contexts, and different historical and political reality. I think there are a set of generic lessons that emerge from Brazil's experience that are relevant for South Africa and relevant for the BRICS. So the first would be a rights-based constitutional and legal framework. The second, a combination of structural economic policies combined with social protection. So an increase in minimum wage and employment conditions combined with cash transfer and not just social protection. The importance of a sophisticated and integrated combination of economic and social policies rather than isolated and disaggregated or dispersed sectoral policies. The importance of social participation, so organizations, social organizations, organized groups, rights holders participate in the design and monitoring and evaluation of social policies. Economic and political stability is key. It's very difficult to ascertain exactly how much Bolsa Familia contributes to inequality. The UNDP in Brazil reckons anything between 16 and 21%. So it is important, but it is not the only thing. And eradicating extreme poverty is only the beginning. And so now the challenge really begins.
It's strange to imagine this, but in the 60s, development theory actually suggested that inequality was good. It was good for growth, it was good for people, and inequality spurred on competition and hence the kind of excellence that people were striving for. And it's only been in the last, I'd say, sort of 10 years that policy makers are starting to think that there was probably something a bit flawed in that. And as a sort of second point of departure, in South Africa, inequality is something that we live and breathe, however invisible it is. If you open the Business Day today, you can see a press article that suggests that in terms of South African incomes, while your average income might be 13,000 Rand per month, your median income, which is 50% of the earned income, is 3,500 Rand a month. On the other hand, you have top CEOs who are earning just under 17 million Rand per month. So for us, it is a stark reality that we live with. I think the other point that we need to remember when talking about South Africa is that our constitution guarantees the right to equality. And the discussion and debate around equality and inequality is that difficult, because what does that mean? Can we approach the constitutional court and say we demand to be equal? On what grounds do we want to be equal? And more challengingly, what are the policies that go into it? But just to briefly reiterate, I mean, inequality is bad for a number of reasons, and you can look at it from a question of moral authority, you can look at it from a point of economic sort of inequality and implications as well. The reason why inequality is bad from an economic perspective is that it actually limits the ability of the country to grow itself. It also limits demand. I mean, if you look at South African income distribution, what is the demand for locally produced goods? It's very limited, because the available cash that most people have is so slight that it goes on survivalist goods. So you can't be promoting your internal industrialization and production. And then the middle class and elites tend to spend more of their money on imported goods. I think if we look at what happened in the Arab Spring recently, if you take Tunisia as an example, the catalyst for the protests was not poverty, but inequality. The fact is that Tunisia had arguably successful anti-poverty strategy for the previous number of years, and a generation of people had moved out of poverty into an aspiring middle class. And university graduates suddenly realized that there was no future for them, there was no hope for them. So it's about that relativity of inequality. But moving on to the question of social policies, I mean, one of the problems where you have such structural inequalities is that really ugly word that nobody wants to talk about, and that's redistribution, where you basically have to take from the rich and give to the poor. In South Africa, you've seen a substantial decline in destitution and absolute poverty as a result of our social grants, our cash grants. And as you've seen the cash grants sort of extend, so you've seen that now the people who are living in destitution are those who live in households that have no worker and no person eligible for social grants, because our social grants are only for children and for old age pensioners. We've got nothing for working age people. It's the missing middle. But social grants have been very effective, as you say, in looking at poverty. But have they had an impact on inequality? So the question is, what is the role of the state then in terms of regulating that kind of monopolistic control of the economy? And are there interventions that can be done in terms of subsidies, even artificially in the first sort of 10, 15 years, to build that sector, which is currently, as a result of historic inequalities, just not able to survive and breathe and grow? And I think that, in my final point, is inequality is a national shame. The voice and the message and the reality and the challenges and the hopes and the aspirations and the loves and the disappointments of people who are living in poverty, for that to actually become projected as the national norm and standard, is what we're looking for. And it's about making sure that our country goes back to basics and is able to learn, but is also able to be innovative and bold in our own choices. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gill. Marianne from the faith-based organizations in Durban. Thank you for a very interesting comparison and also some of the experiences from the different contexts. I lived in Brazil for some time, and that's why I would like to find out the access to food security via the cash transfers. Was that in any way also met with accessibility to means of production, and also especially accessibility to land?
Maybe to start with Adriana, are you able to say something about the sustainability of these trends that we are seeing in Brazil?
We have enormous problems with infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. Our ports, our airports, our roads, our railways, they're not only deficient, they're not interlinked. You see here, Isabella mentioned the extractive model of development, and the investment that's coming in tends to reinforce this extractive model, including Chinese capital. This is less so in Brazil, but in Latin America generally what you have is you have great investment in the ports, and then usually you have a railroad or a road that connects the port to a single mine, which is great for the extractive economy, but if you don't interlink those nodes, you don't get the externalities of that infrastructure. And when we talk about redistribution, this is a big debate in Brazil. It's not necessarily literally taking from the rich and giving it to the poor. It's more about implementing models of development that focus, they trigger, they target growth at the population groups that need it most.
Investment in small farmers to improve their production. It involves state procurement of the production, so there's a guaranteed market, and it connects back into a school food program. So we've got more and more people going into school because of the cash transfer programs that are conditional on enrollment in education, but they're also getting better food, and that better food is coming from locally produced small farmers. So that virtuous circle is something I think very significant, and one of, when you look at public investment, it's still skewed towards the agribusiness sector, but there is a significant investment in what we call in Brazil family farming, or small farmers. Brazil has 36% of the GDP through fiscal revenues, 36% of GDP. That's not as high as Norway or Sweden, but it's double the average across all of Latin America. So they have funds to be able to inject without rocking the boat. But I think that on the sustainability question, Brazil is going to have to tackle these difficult political questions. How do these other sectors of society participate in shaping and deepening democracy? I'm not sure about the recent reforms. I mean, the strength of the union movement and their capacity to negotiate is a clear factor in terms of getting the minimum wage up. And so we've seen an increase in the minimum wage well above inflation over the last 10 years.
In terms of structural obstacles to mobility, I think a number of these are well known. The question of education is central. And then again, we also have growing urban poverty. But also because of the structure of apartheid cities, the working class is situated far away from work because you spend so much of your time and your money I'm getting to the work if you have it. What is protected is race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, colour, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscious belief, culture, language and birth, but we need to have socioeconomic grounds on that as well.
Support given to family farmers. And I think my question is this support significant and is it threatening agribiz in any way? And one hopes that it is threatening agribiz because one sees that as one of the ways that inequality is entrenched.
Now, how can the BRICS economy conduct business, or the BRICS community conduct business in a way that looks at alleviating inequalities?
The Ministry of Agriculture, which deals with export, is not subjected to the same levels of control from society.
But currently the WTO is not working in favour of our developing countries at all, and the whole Doha round has come to a stalemate. The question is there a way in which civil society and progressive elements within the BRICS countries can collaboratively encourage our own countries nationally to collectively adopt certain standards and to agree on certain criteria beyond which we will not fall?
The trouble is, people who actually are opposed to industrial policy use the WTO as an excuse internally. And that's the thing to challenge. You need to just say, look at East Asia, look what they've done, we need to do the same thing. Or you could end poverty for 1.4 billion people worldwide with $66 billion a year. The amounts of increased wealth of the 100 richest people, roughly the number of people in this room, in 2012 was 4 times that much. So the 100 richest people could end world poverty 4 times over. So we just raised the question, is it time to start talking about extreme wealth? Because it's no longer true that taxing the rich is insignificant compared to the overall tax take. It's actually becoming a bit serious.
What have you done in Brazil? How have you managed to increase your employment so well? In what kinds of sectors? Is it public or private, informal, formal, and which sectors of the economy in particular?
The encroachment into the Amazon and linked to the land contestations around biofuel projectization, and what lessons can be learned not only by BRICS community but other countries as well, like Mozambique and Tanzania and Malawi.
Do you think the role of the private sector has been played correctly, and do you think this move of moving away from universities and encouraging people to be sort of artisans, do you think it's the right way in as far as making sure that our development plan comes to fruition?
Environmental Minister Marina Silva was a significant player in terms of addressing this issue of deforestation in the Amazon, but then she left the government, and I think the big question here is we don't hear the word sustainability mentioned in the government discourse. They talk about equality, they talk about poverty, and they talk about eradicating inequality, but they don't talk about sustainability at the same time. So this is a big challenge to get sustainability much more squarely onto the political and public agenda.
But I know that specifically from the qualitative research we've done, given the vast use of the internet in order to promote opportunities, the lack of access means that you have just absolutely no opportunity. So whether you want to enroll at university, or whether you want to try and see what jobs are available in terms of the public employment, government says go to the internet. So where do you begin?
So thank you to all of our panelists from Brazil, South Africa, and the UK for being here and enlightening us. And this is just, you know, one of the events of many. The important place to have these discussions is in Durban, not New York. Yeah? But if it was New York, it'd be one person from Brazil and one person from South Africa claiming to represent, and none of that would get transferred. This is how it should be. So I'm glad that Oxfam's done this. I hope we're going to do lots more, although I know how difficult it is with the time zones and the fact that Brazil's always at Carnival and therefore can't do the teleconferences and all that stuff. You said it last night. To give a really big round of applause to yourselves and to the panelists.